You're not fooling anyone, Claire. Impersonating a federal agent is a felony. Those were the words that came out of my stepfather's mouth. He had one hand on a pair of steel handcuffs, the other resting near the belt of a uniform that looked too crisp to be real. I was mid-briefing, headset on screen lit with faces from the DOJ's Internal Affairs Task Force discussing a pattern of forged credentials tied to ex-law enforcement personnel across 3 states. The call was secured, recorded, and under federal protocol. But none of that mattered at that moment, because Richard Dawson, my mother's husband, had just stormed into the room uninvited, unannounced, and with a tone like he was conducting an arrest. Only he wasn't. And legally, he couldn't. And the uniform he was wearing, the badge, the posture, none of it added up. It looked right, felt close enough to pass if someone wasn't trained to see through it. But I had been trained. It was my job to see through masks like this. He reached for my wrist. I didn't fight back. I let him snap the cuff closed on one side. Because I needed exactly 30 seconds more. 30 seconds until the silent panic trigger I had tapped with my foot completed its cycle. Until the system pinged Washington and activated what we called a Rapid Response Protocol Tier 2. The sound of my name echoed behind him on the briefing screen. Claire. Claire, are you secure? I didn't answer. I made eye contact with the camera, slowly lifted one finger off the desk and pressed the tiny metal button under my keyboard. He didn't notice. He was too busy talking like a man who believed what he was saying, that I had forged my credentials, that I was impersonating someone above my rank, that the whole set-up secure laptop DOJ server link's red light on the door was part of some elaborate lie. But the lie wasn't mine. And in less than 5 minutes, he'd learn exactly how real everything was, including me, and including the 5 black SUVs that had just turned into the driveway. My name is Claire Jensen. I am 41 years old, and I have spent the last 16 years of my life working in the most shadowed corners of the Department of Justice. People think being a cop means chasing suspects through alleys or pulling over speeding cars. That's where I started. Patrol, nights, rain, domestic disputes, and drug busts. I did that part. But early on, a supervisor told me I had quiet eyes. That was her way of saying I noticed what most people missed. The hesitation in a suspect's hand, the tiny crack in a story, the silence where noise should be. Eventually, that got me recruited into internal affairs. It's the part of the DOJ that investigates other law enforcement officers. Not the most popular job. You don't make friends in internal. You make reports. You ask hard questions. You stay clean when everyone around you might not be. For the past 3 years, I've been part of a federal task force focused on impersonation and credential fraud cases, where individuals pretend to be officers, agents, even military officials. Some of them do it for money, some for status, some because power, even false power, makes them feel important. And lately, a pattern had emerged, one involving fake IDs, falsified pension records, and a suspicious number of retired officers popping up in sensitive areas they had no reason to be near. It was quiet, smart, but the kind of quiet that sets off alarms when you know where to listen. That's where I came in. I wasn't undercover, not exactly, but my name wasn't listed publicly on the task force. Only 4 people knew what I was working on. When my own house needed repairs after a storm tore up half the roof, my mother suggested I stay with her for a few weeks. I hesitated. Not because of her, because of him, Richard Dawson. He'd married my mother 12 years ago, called himself a retired officer, claimed he'd served 2 decades with a badge, then left after a psychological burnout following a standoff gone bad. I remember the story. It changed every time he told it. One version had him rescuing hostages. Another had him taking a bullet. The details never stayed consistent. Still, he carried himself like a cop, knew the lingo, had a faded badge and a cracked leather wallet, used words like probable cause and chain of custody like most people said please and thank you. He kept a scanner on his phone and a uniform in the closet. My mother believed him. Most people did. But something about him had always made me uneasy. The way he spoke over her. The way he watched me when I mentioned work. Like he was measuring me. Like he didn't trust the idea of me being more than just his stepdaughter. So when my supervisor asked if I had a secure location to work remotely while our office rerouted servers, I had a decision to make. I could have said no. I could have stayed in a hotel, made up an excuse, or stalled. Instead, I said I'll stay with my mother. Not because it was comfortable, but because Richard Dawson's name had just appeared at the bottom of a list. Not at the top. Not enough to warrant a formal investigation. But enough for me to want to look twice. That's what I do best, after all. I looked twice. Richard Dawson was the kind of man who walked into a room like it owed him something. He had a voice made for radio, deep, firm, just slow enough to sound deliberate. People listened when he talked. My mother did. Neighbors did. Strangers did too. When I first met him, I was 28 and already in uniform. I shook his hand and he gripped it just a second too long, sizing me up. "You carry yourself like a soldier," he said. "You military," I told him no, that I was with the department. "Detective," he asked with raised eyebrows that didn't hide the smirk. "Working on it," I replied. That was our pattern from the beginning, me stepping forward, him pressing down just enough to remind me I still had something to prove. My mother met him at a community fundraiser. She was volunteering, passing out flyers. He showed up in uniform or what looked like one offering to help. She said he was kind, protective, that he made her feel safe again after years of loneliness. I didn't argue. She deserved someone. I just wasn't sure this was someone real. Richard told her he'd retired early after a traumatic incident. He had all the right scars, bad knee stories about night patrols, a photo on the mantle of him in uniform from 20 years ago, blurry, grainy, but close enough. He wore a sheriff's department jacket everywhere, even in summer. He dropped police codes into regular conversation like seasoning. And whenever I asked simple questions, what precinct, what year, his answers were just a little too vague. Back east, he'd say, "Before your time. Small town work. Nothing like what you do." But it wasn't just the evasiveness. It was the control. He corrected my mother when she spoke too freely. He commented on my posture, my tone. He once told me real authority doesn't need to explain itself. I remember thinking that real authority doesn't need to announce itself every time it enters the room either. Still, I kept my distance. I lived across the state. I sent flowers on her birthday, called on holidays. But we weren't close. Not after Richard moved in. The house didn't feel safe anymore, even though he made such a show of being the protector. When I did visit, I noticed the pattern. He didn't like questions he couldn't answer. He didn't like silence he didn't control. He didn't like that I outranked the idea of him. So when my supervisor suggested remote work and my mother offered her guest room, I didn't say yes out of convenience. I said yes out of instinct. Something was off. Richard had no verified pension record. His badge number came back unmatched in the National Registry. His police scanner was tuned to jurisdictions hundreds of miles away. He had too much access and no authority to match. But the man had spent a lifetime pretending to be in charge. And I needed to know why. It started with a storm. A late spring windstorm rolled through my neighborhood and peeled half the shingles from my roof. Rain got in through the attic and ruined the electrical wiring in 2 rooms. I had to move out while the repairs were underway. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. My supervisor said to take the opportunity to work remotely. I considered a hotel near the field office. I even booked one. But then my mother called. "You can stay with us," she said. "The guest room's empty and Richard fixed the lock last month. You'll have privacy." I hesitated. She noticed. "It's just a few weeks," she added. "He'll stay out of your way." He won't, I thought, but I didn't say it. because just 2 days earlier, my task force had flagged a name in a new report, Richard Dawson. His name wasn't at the top of the list. He wasn't a primary suspect. But the data suggested a pattern: several individuals using law enforcement credentials to gain access to restricted areas, usually former officers, mostly male, mostly retired. His name came in at number 9. Too low to act on, too high to ignore. So I said yes. I told my supervisor I had a controlled environment available, that I could set up a secure system with end-to-end encryption plus my own hardware. That part was true. What I didn't say was that I suspected my mother's husband might be living under a false identity. I'd tried to pull his pension records once years ago out of curiosity. Nothing came back. No departmental match. I chalked it up to clerical error or regional archiving. Not all small-town departments fed into the national database back then. But now, in light of the cases we'd been tracking, it didn't sit right. So I treated it like I would any other target. I packed my gear: an encrypted laptop, portable VPN router, smart recorder, a signal interruption module that looked like a phone charger. I locked down all non-work accounts and set up a clean line for DOJ communications. I didn't go there as a daughter. I went there as an investigator. The first day went smoothly. My mother had stocked the fridge, folded towels, and set out a fresh blanket on the bed. Richard offered a nod from his recliner. He didn't stand, didn't speak. That was fine. The guest room was small, but adequate. I did a quick sweep: no surveillance, no wireless interference. I changed the lock to one of my own, nothing fancy, just enough to give me control over entry. I taped a red indicator light to the door frame. When it was on, it meant I was in a live briefing. That detail had kept me safe in 2 other field assignments. I hoped it would hold here too. For the first few days it did. Richard hovered, but he didn't interfere. He passed through the hallway, sometimes during calls. Once he asked if I wanted coffee, just loud enough for my microphone to catch it. Another time he knocked, then said he thought he heard the fire alarm beep. But then things shifted. One morning, I found the door ajar even though I'd locked it. Another night, I noticed the desk chair moved slightly. My laptop had a fingerprint scan I hadn't enabled. I enabled it immediately. I told myself it was paranoia, but the truth was I trusted paranoia more than I trusted comfort. The real confirmation came when I found a receipt in the kitchen trash: online purchase, tactical-grade handcuffs, expedited shipping. Name on the order: Richard D. I didn't sleep much that night. I told myself he was posturing, reenacting some old routine from a job he maybe once held. But in the back of my mind, I knew he was preparing for something. So I prepared too. I added a silent trigger under the desk, linked it to the DOJ emergency protocol line. One press, and I could flag a Tier 2 threat, just in case. Not because I thought he'd hurt me, but because I didn't know what part of his story was real anymore. And I wasn't about to find out the hard way. By the end of the first week, the quiet had changed. It wasn't peaceful. It was calculated. Richard stopped making small talk. He started watching. Not obviously, he never stood outside my door like a cartoon villain, but he was always nearby, always within earshot. If I opened my door, he'd be in the hallway. If I walked to the kitchen, he was already pouring coffee. If I came back late from a meeting, he'd ask how traffic was, even though I hadn't mentioned I'd left. He'd been retired for years or so, he claimed, yet he still acted like he was running surveillance. One evening, I came out of my room after a long call. The house was dim. My mother had gone to bed. Richard was in the living room recliner, a police scanner playing softly through his phone. I paused, still listening to that old thing I asked. "Just habit," he said without looking at me. "Some of us don't unplug so easy." I nodded. "What's the channel local jurisdiction?" "Crime updates. You'd be surprised what they miss." I sat at the kitchen table pretending to check my phone. He didn't speak again, but I could feel his eyes shift toward me. Later that night, I checked the scanner log on his phone while he was in the shower. It wasn't tuned to our local station. It was bouncing between encrypted digital channels, ones used by DOJ, DEA, and occasionally military liaison units. You don't stumble onto those by accident. The next day, I placed a decoy folder on my desktop, DOJ Ops. Draft brief. Empty, except for a single dummy file. By nightfall, the file had been opened and closed 3 times. I didn't say a word. I just narrowed the access protocols further. 2 days later, a slip of paper appeared near the coffee machine. On it were 3 partial names: Shaw E., Mendez, Jensen. All in my contact list. Misspelled, but phonetically close. It was subtle, but it was a test. He was fishing, trying to confirm something. When I confronted him lightly, almost joking, I said, "You've been taking notes on my calls." He shrugged. "You work in federal enforcement." "Of course, I take notes. You think the people you work for aren't watching me?" "That's paranoia," I said carefully. He leaned in a little. "No, that's experience." I didn't respond. Because I'd heard that phrase before. It was a line used by a known impersonator from a case I'd helped close 6 months ago. A man who used his fake badge to gain access to police databases who claimed he was doing the government's job when they got lazy. He said the same thing. "That's not paranoia. That's experience." It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. Richard believed he was serving a purpose. That what he was doing, watching me, listening, tracking, was justified. That I was the threat. He didn't see me as family anymore. He saw me as an operation. The final confirmation came the morning I found my secondary device tampered with. The access logs showed an attempt to bypass the biometric lock. A failed attempt. The device was hidden, camouflaged. No one but me should have known it existed. Unless they were searching, unless they were desperate. I didn't accuse him. That would have tipped the balance. I simply added a new layer to my fallback protocol. One press of my heel under the desk would trigger an alert through DOJ's internal channel. I'd already prepared a soft report on Richard's behavior, unofficial, no formal accusations, just a field memo with incident details and timestamps. All I needed was the moment. The final line crossed. I didn't have to wait long. It was a Thursday morning, overcast, still. I woke before my alarm, my body sensing something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. There was a quiet in the house that didn't feel natural, not peaceful, intentional, staged. I brewed coffee. My mother wasn't up yet. Richard's truck was still in the driveway, but I hadn't heard him walking around. No scanner playing from the living room, no coughs, no pacing, just silence. I returned to my room and shut the door, locking it twice. Today's briefing wasn't routine. It was a tiered information sync between 5 senior members of the DOJ task force, including my direct supervisor. The subject, a suspected identity fraud case that had just escalated after a regional database was finally restored from a 2007 archive backup. In that backup, a name had resurfaced: Richard Allen, alias Richard Dawson, 2 counts of federal impersonation, 1 sealed indictment, fingerprint records incomplete due to system corruption at the time. But the photo, it was enough. Same jawline, same eyes. A few years younger, but unmistakable. The moment I saw it in the shared report, I felt the shift like a click inside my chest. I uploaded it into a locked presentation folder. I wouldn't show it right away. I needed the conversation to flow naturally first. A setup. At exactly 800 hours, I initiated the secure connection. The DOJ server verified my IP and location. Audio sync came first, then faces, my supervisor, 2 forensic analysts, 1 operations director. I began the briefing like normal. We reviewed 2 linked cases, both involving fake retirement credentials used to access law enforcement resources, 1 in Nevada, 1 in Florida. Then I moved to the data update. I said calmly, newly restored records from a corrupted 2007 archive have produced 5 matches. 4 are inactive. 1 is in active circulation. I highlighted the name Richard Allen. Then I paused. My supervisor leaned forward. Claire, do we know where this subject is located? I nodded. Current alias places him in California. Age aligns. Physical match confirmed. Status: living with family. No known active threats. But behavior has shifted. My supervisor narrowed her eyes. And how close are you to the subject? I took a breath. I'm in the same house. A long silence followed. Then she said, Claire, do you need an extraction? I shook my head. Not yet. We continued. 23 minutes into the call, just as I was summarizing the potential risk points, I heard it. A slow, deliberate twist of the doorknob. I muted the mic. My red indicator light was on bright and clear. It had been on since the session began. The rules were established: do not interrupt when the red light is active. But I knew it wasn't my mother. The door didn't jiggle. It cracked open, careful, precise. And then I heard the voice. Claire, step away from the desk. I turned, still seated. Richard stood in the doorway wearing what looked like an old federal field jacket. He had handcuffs in one hand and a printed document in the other. His face was flushed, jaw locked. You're using unauthorized systems, he said, accessing federal files without jurisdiction. I have probable cause. I didn't move. He stepped closer. You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer. I didn't laugh, didn't argue, because my foot was already pressed firmly against the trigger panel under the desk. 5 seconds to silent alert. I looked him in the eye. Richard, I said, calm and steady. I need you to leave this room. You don't give orders here, he snapped. I've seen your files. None of this checks out. You're playing a dangerous game, and I'm putting a stop to it. He grabbed my wrist and clicked the first cuff. That was enough. The alert went through. 5 black SUVs were already on the move. The moment the first cuff clicked shut around my wrist, I knew we had crossed the line. Richard stood over me, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His voice had dropped into that controlled, rehearsed cadence that people use when they want to sound official. That, more than anything, told me he had practiced this. Not just in theory, but in his mind over and over again. You think you're smart, he said. You think hiding behind laptops and encrypted channels makes you untouchable. I didn't respond. He yanked my arm behind me hard. Pain shot up to my shoulder. He was stronger than I remembered, or maybe just more desperate. I've been watching, he continued, listening. You're not who you say you are. These people on your screen, they're actors, part of the scam. He bent down and grabbed the other wrist. I'm taking you in. The second cuff locked. From the hallway, I heard a gasp. My mother. Richard, she said, voice small. What are you doing? He didn't even look at her. I'm protecting us. She's been lying since day one. None of this is real. I could hear the panic in her breathing. Claire, she asked. I turned my head slightly. I need you to step back, Mom. Everything's under control. Control, Richard barked. You're under arrest. This is my house, my rules, and you brought something dangerous here. He motioned to my laptop still glowing on the desk. On the screen, the briefing had frozen. The DOJ team had cut the feed the second I activated the trigger. The system was designed that way: lock everything, reroute files, initiate trace logs, all automated, all silent. Richard didn't know any of that. He was still pretending he had the upper hand. I've served in 3 counties, he muttered. I've arrested real criminals, people who thought they were clever. You're just another one of them. You've never served anywhere, I said softly. That made him pause. What did you say? I said, I repeated, you've never served. And in about 3 minutes, the people who have are going to prove it. He stared at me. For a second, I thought he might hit me. Instead, he stepped back, looked toward the window, and froze. The low growl of engines filled the street. One by one, 5 matte black SUVs turned into the driveway. The moment those SUVs appeared, something in Richard collapsed. He stepped away from me like I'd burned him. His hands dropped to his sides. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Through the front window, we could see them clearly black, unmarked government plates moving in perfect synchronization. No sirens, no lights, just silent authority. He turned to my mother as if she might explain it all away, but she was already moving to the door. "Evelyn," he said sharply, "don't open that. Too late." She unlocked the door just as the first team reached the porch. 4 agents entered without hesitation. No weapons drawn yet, but everything about their stance said they were ready. The lead agent was tall, steady-eyed, and wore a DOJ tactical vest. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at me. "Claire Jensen," he asked. "Confirmed," I said. "Senior Investigator Task Force Delta." He nodded once, then turned. "Sir, step away from the federal officer immediately." Richard blinked. She's pretending." The agent cut him off. "You are currently detaining a federal investigator under active assignment. That is a felony offense." "This is a mistake," Richard stammered. "She's not on any record. I checked. I ran her name." "Incorrect," the agent said calmly. "You accessed restricted systems without authorization. We traced your search activity. We know what you've been doing." Richard backed toward the hallway, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't. She's lying." The second agent stepped forward, removing the handcuffs from my wrists with practiced precision. "Are you injured?" Investigator Jensen negative, I replied. "But I'm requesting immediate seizure of this location. Full search authorization under Code 46A, granted, the lead said. 2 more agents swept past me into the hallway. My mother stood frozen near the stairs, clutching the railing like it might steady her. They began reading Richard his rights. He didn't fight. He just kept saying the same thing over and over again. She's not who she says she is. But by then, it was clear. I was exactly who I said I was, and he had never been. As they escorted him out, the house felt both louder and quieter than it had in days. I watched the SUVs load up and pull away. 5 doors closed in sequence, and Richard Dawson, or whoever he really was, left the house for the last time. Richard Dawson wasn't real. That became official 36 hours after the arrest, when our team processed the fingerprints recovered from the house and matched them to an inactive federal case file. His real name was Richard Allen, born in Illinois. No known law enforcement certifications, no military record, no pension, no badges ever issued under his name. In 2007, he had been placed under investigation for impersonating a federal marshal. He'd been selling fake credentials, forging clearance levels, even running a low-level consulting operation where he advised small-town sheriffs in exchange for access to their records. The case fell apart when the lead agent retired unexpectedly, and a server corruption lost several files during a database migration. The charges were dropped pending further verification. Then he disappeared. Until now. The photo in the old report was 10 years out of date, but once you saw it, there was no doubt. It was him. Different haircut, less gray. Same eyes, same expression. The arrogance was baked into the frame. He'd reinvented himself under the name Richard Dawson. Slipped into towns where background checks were light, where stories passed for facts, and where an old leather badge and a cracked wallet could buy enough respect to last a lifetime. He told people he was retired, that he'd seen things they wouldn't understand, that he didn't like to talk about the past. And they believed him. So did my mother. He met her in a grocery store, helped her carry bags to her car. She said he was respectful, kind. Told her he'd moved there to get away from the noise. Within 6 months, they were dating. A year later, married. He moved into her home, took over small repairs, paid bills on time, took pride in polishing his old badge, an unnumbered replica, likely ordered online, and telling half stories about traffic stops and bar fights from the old days. She never saw anything suspicious. Why would she? He was polite, attentive, protective. Predators often are. When I requested the full file, I also found transcripts from a 2006 interview. Back then, Richard had insisted he was doing what the system failed to do. He believed the government was lax, that too many people were slipping through. So he'd appointed himself as a kind of watchdog. He called it justice. That's what made him dangerous. He didn't see himself as a con man. He saw himself as the last line of defense. And in the past 3 weeks, he'd convinced himself that I was the threat. He had been watching me since I moved in, logging times, contact names, how long my briefings lasted. He'd accessed a stolen admin-level password to trace portions of my work system, flagging anything he didn't understand as evidence of fraud. He wasn't just impersonating authority. He believed he was authority. That's why he felt justified storming into my room. That's why he put me in handcuffs, because the story in his head said he was the hero, the man who caught the criminal. Only this time, the criminal wasn't real, but I was. When we confronted him with the evidence, he denied everything, claimed I had framed him, said the photos were doctored, the records faked. Even as agents pulled hard drives and file boxes from the garage, even as they uncovered fake credentials, forged contracts, and printed IDs, he refused to accept the truth. I did what I had to do, he said in his first interview. She was dangerous. He meant me, even after everything he thought I was the problem. But the DOJ didn't. He was charged with multiple counts: impersonation of a federal officer, unauthorized access of government systems, obstruction of justice, and unlawful detention of a federal agent. The impersonation charge alone carried a sentence of up to 3 years. The rest added up to something far heavier. He would never walk free again. And the man my mother had lived with for over a decade would be erased by paperwork, fingerprints, and a truth that had waited too long to surface. I watched her read the final report. Her hands trembled. She didn't cry. I should have known, she said softly. There were signs. He was careful, I told her. He needed you to believe. I did. I nodded. So did most people. That was the hardest part, not proving who he was, but realizing how easily people believe someone just because they speak like they've been in charge their whole life. My mother sat at the edge of the couch, holding the printed report in her lap like it might vanish if she let go. She hadn't spoken much since the agents cleared the house, since the SUVs disappeared down the street. It had been 2 days. The house was quiet in a different way now, not staged, just hollow. I looked at that man every day, she said finally. I ate breakfast with him, shared a bed, believed every word. How does someone do that for 10 years? I didn't answer right away. There wasn't a clean explanation. There rarely is. He didn't just lie to me, she added. He built a whole life around the lie. All those nights he said he had nightmares about the job. He used to wake up sweating, shake, cry sometimes. I looked at her. That part may not have been fake. She blinked. What do you mean? I mean, people like Richard live in fear too. Not fear of being caught, at least not always, but fear of losing the story. Fear of being questioned. He created that identity because it gave him control, power. He probably convinced himself it was real. She nodded, slowly, eyes distant. I used to think you were cold, she said quietly. That caught me off guard. Not in a cruel way. Just closed. Like you didn't want anyone getting in. I didn't, I said. Now I understand why. She stood and walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, then returned to the couch. Her shoulders seemed heavier now. Not broken, just honest, like she wasn't pretending anymore. You protected the country, Claire, she said. And I couldn't even protect my own home. That wasn't your job, I replied. But it is now. She looked up. To do what she asked. To rebuild, I said. Not the house. You. We sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just real. She finally whispered, "I don't know who I am without him." "You'll figure it out," I said. I did. Then I stood, touched her shoulder gently, and left her with the truth. Not the full truth, but the part she needed most. They gave me the option to avoid the interview, said I didn't have to see him again, that someone else could handle the final intake before transfer, but I asked for it. Richard sat across from me in a concrete-walled room at the temporary holding facility. No windows, no clock, just 2 chairs, 1 table, and the weight of everything we hadn't said. His hands were cuffed, this time for real. He looked different, smaller, not physically, but somehow reduced. His posture lacked the practiced authority he once carried like armor. His face was pale, lips dry, but his eyes still searched mine for control. "You came to gloat?" he asked. "No," I said. "I came to finish the report." He smirked, barely. "Still doing your job. Always." There was a pause. Then softer, "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." "You did," I said. "You lied to everyone who trusted you. I kept your mother safe. You kept her in the dark." He looked down. "I watched you," he said quietly. "You were always so careful. So cold. I couldn't tell what you were hiding, so I started digging. And when I found nothing, you assumed I was the one pretending." He nodded. "I couldn't imagine you had all that power and didn't flaunt it. Who hides that kind of authority? People who don't need to prove it," I said. Another pause. "Why didn't you turn me in sooner?" he asked. "Because I wasn't sure. But you knew. I suspected. And I waited. Gave you the chance to stop." He looked at the table. Not with shame, more like calculation. "You won't testify, will you?" "I don't need to," I said. "The evidence speaks louder than I ever could." He looked up again. "Do you think Evelyn still loves me?" I didn't answer right away. "She's figuring out who she is without you," I said. "That's more important than how she feels about you." He gave a small, bitter laugh. "You always thought you were better than me." "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending I was smaller." I stood ready to leave. "You'll never know what it's like," he said as I reached the door. "To spend your whole life trying to be someone." I turned to face him. "You're wrong," I said. "I just didn't lie about who I was." Then I walked out, and I didn't look back. 2 weeks later, I stood alone on my porch, watching the evening light stretch across the quiet street. The same street where 5 black SUVs had pulled in not so long ago. The same front steps where everything shifted, where a man pretending to protect me tried to arrest me, and where the truth finally caught up to him. People think power is loud. They imagine it in shouts, sirens, courtroom speeches. But that day taught me something else. Real power is silent. It's in the stillness of not flinching when someone doubts you. It's in holding your ground when someone tries to reduce you. It's in knowing exactly who you are and no longer needing their permission to be it. I didn't press charges for personal reasons. I didn't demand an apology. What I wanted was never revenge. It was clarity. And I got it. Richard Allen will spend the rest of his life under federal watch. Not because I punished him, but because his lies finally ran out of places to hide. He built a house of stories. I didn't knock it down. I just turned on the lights. As for my mother, she's healing. Slowly, carefully. We talk more now than we ever did. She asks questions she never dared to before. She listens differently. She sees me, and I see her. Not as someone who was fooled, but as someone finally free. Sometimes I still hear echoes of Richard's voice in my head. Not the words, but the tone of certainty, of false authority. But I let it pass through me now because I know it doesn't belong to me. That voice isn't mine. Mine is quieter, but it speaks the truth. And sometimes that's enough.